Okay, well, with no further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Mike McCrellis, founder and executive director of Impact Frontiers. I'm joined by several of my teammates, Tatiana, Marina, Peter, and I'm so pleased to be joined also by Karim Harji and by Tania Rodríguez, who each of them, I'll leave them to introduce themselves um, on this topic of systemic investing and systems mapping. I'm going to quickly get out of the way to make room for the stars of the show to shine. But just to briefly say that this is a topic that we at Impact Frontiers have interest in, both as the use of systems and systems thinking and systems mapping to manage direct impacts and to manage impact risk of impact investing, as well as in the ability to shift broader systems. And finally, for our own use, as we think about the systems in which we engage as impact frontiers and how can we productively and constructively engage with those systems. So um, in this conversation, we have Karim, who's brought to the market recently a suite of resources in partnership with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors that can support investors in developing their systems thinking and systems mapping approach. And Tania Rodriguez from who, um, when Impact Frontiers put out a case study on systems mapping for impact management a year ago, we couldn't find examples. And then just after we put it out, I met Tania, and she had been doing this for 10 years. And so we are so grateful to Tania for being willing to share what she's been doing and working on with all of you as a really great concrete worked example. So with that, we're going to get started. We'll have the first half of the webinar approximately for Karim, the last half for Tanya, and then hopefully with some time for discussion with both of them and with all of you. So with that, I will hand it over to Karim to kick us off.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to be here with all of you. Great to see so many familiar faces and many new ones. Thank you, Mike, for just giving us the platform to talk about this topic, which is both very topical, but also where we have a lot more to do. So I'm Karim Harji. As Mike said, I have been working on some new resources just at this intersection of systems thinking and impact investing that I'm going to share with you. Some of you may have seen this. I've just posted the link in the chat, and I'm just going to talk through what this work looks like and how you might use it. And I'm going to point to maybe as we go along a few other resources just to be able to bring these ideas to life. So just to situate this work, I've been working with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors on a few different things related to impact investing, and then more recently thinking about the systems lens on top of this work. Some of you may be familiar with the Impact Investing Handbook, which came out, I think, about 5 years ago, which was meant as a guide for asset owners to think through all the stages of how you develop a strategy, implement, and then just think about how you do impact investing well. In some ways, drawing on the experience of both practitioners as well as advisors and a range of different kinds of asset owners. What's interesting about this is if you look at the first three chapters of the handbook, they all have a systems lens to them. So in some ways, I think one interesting comment that's come up more often recently as I've been immersed in this work is you don't have to use the language of systems to do this kind of work, because sometimes it can be helpful, sometimes it can get in the way, and sometimes you just need a different set of on-ramps or intervention kind of points when you bring in this language around systems. So that for me has been interesting learning. But if you're just starting out on building an impact investing strategy or just thinking about what are the fundamental aspects around that, I would start on the left. And then what I'm going to talk about today are the two resources that we launched earlier this year, the primer and the playbook. The primer is the series of about a kind of year of just research and development, both with impact investors as well as advisors, thinking about how, when you bring a systems lens to the work that we do in impact investing, what does it actually change? And what are the ways in which we may adapt our default strategies to think about the ways in which a systems orientation shifts what we do in practice, but also the kinds of goals, how we work, and how we think. And the playbook is to make some of that more tactical. Because sometimes, at least for me too, I found that some of this work can feel quite abstract and inaccessible and frankly, even intimidating. And the playbook is a series of tools that guide you in a quite structured way to think about these issues at each stage of developing strategy, governance, investment processes, and of course, IMM. And so I'm going to preview those today. We're actually going to use some of our polls to test some of the tools together so you can see how they might work in practice, and then happy to answer any questions as well after. I assume that one of the reasons many of you are here is because you are frustrated by the impact of impact investing, or at least recognize that it's not as linear as sometimes the models and ways we've talked about it operate in practice. So these are some of the things we heard. Like, why do people care about bringing a systems perspective to how we think about impact investing? We've come a long way over the last 15 plus years in how we think about and do impact investing, and there's still some fundamental challenges and maybe even constraints. Sometimes our models and tools don't account for complexity. They might feel overly transactional. They're not fully utilizing the range of tools that we have at our disposal when we think about the ability to bring philanthropy, multi-asset classes, multiple sectors to how we think about what the role of capital could be in advancing change and some of the root causes, and also some frustration around thinking about where we get stuck, whether it's ESG or singular thematic approaches, etc. So I won't spend too much time on this because there are a lot of other organizations like Transcap and Twist and the Investment Integration Project that have spent much more time thinking about the conceptual scaffolding for systems lens. And I'm sure Tania and the team are going to talk about what they have done, because I know they've spent a lot of time thinking through what this looks like. But these were just some of the things that we heard at the highest level. And the focus of this work was trying to simplify it a little bit, because even for me, as both someone who builds these frameworks but also advises investors, I found that you need to boil it down sometimes to just a few of these aspects and then think about the so what. And so the bulk of what this work looks like is, when you bring a systems orientation to impact investing, what does it actually change in practice? It changes a lot about how you see the world and how you think, the mindset's perspective. And the four elements that kind of kept coming up include that you really just broaden your perspective. You look beyond your individual transactions, you think about the portfolios you're building and your role within the ecosystem that you work with, but also have to step up one level, probably beyond where you're operating today. This also involves thinking about the dynamics of how capital interacts with different actors. What are the multiple feedback loops? What is not just the relationship between capital to investees, but also from investees back to investors, and all of the intermediaries that allow this kind of idea of moving from the intentions to actual results, and both intended and unintended effects over time. Interestingly, this also forces you to reconcile the idea that financial capital is just one part of the picture of how change happens. This might seem obvious to many of us, but sometimes we think that capital is the primary driver. That may be the case, but it's not always the case. And I mean, one big part of this is really the idea, also based on the frustration and limited, let's say, effects of some forms of impact investing, that we really need to get a little bit deeper around the root causes, not just the symptoms or the surface level of first order effects. So these are just a very, very simplified version of what it means when we bring a systems orientation. And I'm going to talk about how the primer and the playbook have essentially now taken it to a level where we think about, well, what do we do about this? What does it imply around how we change the way we work? And what are some of the combinations that you can start testing in practice? So while it's meant for asset owners, you'll see that some of our case studies are actually asset managers that have adopted a systemic perspective, but also it's based on interviews with advisors. So whether you are in an investment capacity or in an IMM capacity or advising on either of those, there's something here for you. The idea is to take these broader concepts, think about different options and starting points, but also try and meet every investor based on where they are. The point of this also was to make this less intimidating than it tends to be. And it means breaking it down into saying, here's the conceptual aspects, here's a number of tactical options, here's where you could start, and here's where you could go. So we really think about this as the aspects of the journey. It's an overused word sometimes in this world, but the whole point is to provide options regardless of where you are. And I'll explain what that looks like in practice. The primer provides almost the conceptual scaffolding. The playbook provides the practice implementation guidance. And so alongside the primer, the playbook is 8 different tools. We'll test 2 of them today on our session, which unpacks different levels at which how you can bring systems thinking into your work. Whether you're just getting started and want to know where you stand, whether you want to be able to layer this into different parts of investment processes, whether you want to bring this into your strategy and governance, or into your IMM. And we'll spend a little bit more time on the IMM side, just given the audience today, and particularly where I think many people are really thinking about how to push the boundaries. On the IMM side, we're really bringing in a systems orientation directly into the IMP dimensions and into impact risk. And it's been fascinating for me as a practitioner to just think about how to unlearn a lot of what I thought I learned around what those concepts mean in practice. So, as probably I'm sure Tania and Mike will talk about later, a lot of this involves both changing your mindset and unlearning some of the default behaviors, but then also testing new combinations that you might be doing today. We'll go through these tools today using the polls, but you can download them right away and test them in your own context. They're all interactive, they're all open source, and they're based on experience of myself and others who've been advising investors. Let's start actually with poll 1. Tatiana, if you can pull this up for everyone. So poll 1 is actually based on worksheet 1, which is a series of expectations and belief statements that came from both research and practice, which includes a range of ways people think about what a systems orientation brings to the work that we're doing. So we picked 5 statements from, I believe there's about 20 of them here. And so just pick the statement that resonates most with you. The actual exercise is to do this with your teams, pick 3 statements, and then actually just have a discussion. As you read through them, you can see that there are both a range of different implications, but also different positioning around each of these statements. For example, as we think about statement number 1, that systems-oriented portfolios should include both market rate and concessionary, that's both a question, but also there are some implications for that if you're thinking about what kind of investor you might have positioned yourself to be. That's very different than the statement around investors should be willing to stay invested longer than traditional timelines to see systemic changes. Now, this came out of both one of the challenges which investors talk about often, which is, hey, I have a defined time horizon on which I make investment decisions, and others that say, well, maybe that's where I have more flexibility in terms of my time horizon. Interestingly, which seems to be the leading contender right now, portfolio construction should include interventions that address different leverage points in a system. The implications of that, as we'll talk about a little bit later, are very different when you think about what portfolio construction looks like when you're just looking at risk and return in a conventional sense than if you bring systemic perspectives. And the one that probably a lot of us IMM folks are interested in is engaging with negative or unintended effects is as important as promoting positive impacts. So why don't we just close the poll now, just to give everyone a sense of where we're at, because I want to just see how that gets reflected. So Tatiana, I don't know if we can share this or if probably it's already being shared. Interesting for me, because it's the first time this has become number 1, is portfolio construction. Number 2 was systems change requires actively influencing or using non-financial assets to influence beyond investment activities. And then you see the spread of the others. Why is this interesting? Because even in this crowd, we've got a range of different options. If you were to do this with your colleagues, your immediate team or your expanded team, you probably will get a similar range. And the implications of discussing what this looks like in your roles and in your almost like the things you bring to the work have different implications. So I won't spend too much time on this because I want to get into the primer and the framework and some of the components there. But this is an example of a tool, which is worksheet 1 for a reason, one of the big challenges of this work is that people think they know what this work means or implies, or they just have different perspectives on how they want to engage with it. And so this is a good way to think about pulling that out more explicitly, bring those implicit beliefs to become explicit in a way that isn't immediately, let's call it confrontational or problematic. You're just asking people what they think. You're beginning to have a discussion of what it might imply, and you're then beginning to understand what it could be as you think about how you move forward in a more systemic way. So I'm going to just move us along, but I think if there's any comments in the chat around what statement you picked, were you looking to pick more than one statement and why? Could you use this with your colleagues? Are there other things that this initial exercise provoked? I would love to see that in the chat and as we go along. But let me just move us to the next slide, just in the interest of time. I'm going to next just give you a very quick walkthrough on the key elements of the primer. Now, the primer is a series of 6 components, each of which has been broken down into a set of aspects like this. So there's one major component. There are 3 different shifts underneath that. And then there's a range of implications around where you might start or where you could go. And why this is helpful is because sometimes it takes these really broader, more conceptual ideas, which you might not argue with necessarily, but then tries to unpack the implications of what it could mean in practice. I want to stress that this is not meant to be prescriptive. It is not universal necessarily, and it's not meant to be exhaustive. This is just a starting point of the different ways that you could think about how to move from ideas to application. And so I'll run through the first 3. We'll do a bit of a poll and exercise before I run through the next 3. You can download the primer and look at all the different combinations. These are just a subset. And for each one of the 6 shifts, there is a broad description, there are starting points, and there are points of ambition. So if you're already doing some of this work, you should move right to the right-hand column. If this is new for you, you can just start in one or two of the places that are described here. So let me give you an example. The first component is that if you're doing this work, if you're applying a systems lens to impact investing, the implication is that you have to actually value a systems perspective. Now, this may seem obvious, but it actually is quite fundamental because the conventional way of thinking in much of impact investing, both in our processes, in the ways we use our language and our narrative, and in how we do our reporting, is actually quite linear. It doesn't build in explicitly complexity thinking. It doesn't necessarily by default bring in interconnections, feedback loops, dynamic ways of looking at the world. And so many of you have probably already done a systems map for one investment area. And that's a great starting point. But what if you were able to go further? What if you were able to bring, more systemic goals or frame your goals in more systemic ways across multiple investments or across your entire portfolio? What if you were able to essentially bring a broader understanding of what impact looks like when you have a broader understanding of how you could actually influence the different parts of the system you work in? So step 1 is really just thinking about moving your thinking from linear to complex, understanding that you may have to shift the way you think about goals and your understanding of change. And the implication of that is that you may have to embrace different perspectives and data sources. And you can see here there are a number of different ways to do that. Next, rethinking the way that you look at the different forms of capital. One way to think about this is bring different forms of capital more intentionally, whether that's through blended finance or catalytic capital. You may also need to think differently about how you leverage and co-invest in alignment with others. This often means that you partner with others more intentionally to do things that you wouldn't be able to do on your own. And one implication of systemic work is sometimes your time horizon might look longer than your default. It doesn't mean that applies across every asset class necessarily, but you may be able to bring that in much more explicitly and deliberately upfront. This also means that you might look at new fund structures, new types of incentives, and just different ways of thinking about what your capital stack or your portfolio looks like. If you're really ambitious, you can also look at a multi-decade perspective on your portfolio. So again, there are starting points. Experiment with a blended finance deal. Think about some long-term targets beyond what you normally would do, but you can go much further about looking at this in a much more holistic way. And the third component, which we'll pause right after this and is probably particularly important for the Impact Frontiers community, is just rethinking the relationship between individual investments and your portfolio. Now, conventional theory, there's multiple versions of conventional theory, really look at each investment in relation to classic factors around risk and return. So you're trying to mitigate your risk, you're looking at diversity, you're looking at different classic parameters and hoping that you can still generate the impact you're looking for. With systems thinking, you probably flip that equation pretty significantly. You might be doubling down on saying, if I've identified a leverage point, what are multiple investments I can make around that leverage point to be able to really shift things in a much more deliberate and targeted way? This may actually be counter to classic theory that might say you have to diversify away from that. You might say, I'm doubling down because I think that's where I can make the most change. Another way to start is just saying, can I ask different questions in how I screen and select investments? This may mean you just bring more systemic considerations upfront right from the first screen. Or it might mean that you're thinking about what is the basis of how I think about short-term change and long-term change right away into how I think about setting expectations and then measuring performance over time. So I think what's really cool about this is that you can do this today. If you are using any of the Impact Frontiers curriculum, you can layer some of this indirectly if you haven't already. But it does force you to probably rethink fundamentally some of, modern portfolio theory and how it might be aligned or even in conflict with how you operate if you want to operate at a systems level. Why don't we pull up poll 2 just to make this real for people? So poll 2 is based on, Tatiana, if you can launch that for us while I'm explaining it. Poll 2 is based on worksheet number 2 in the playbook. Worksheet 2 is breaking down each of these shifts into almost layman's language into a series of 5 practices or criteria for each of the shifts. So this is the one for shift number 3. And so pick the shift that resonates most with you from this. This is meant to be a diagnostic. So if you're an impact investor that already says that I've got a systemic approach to my work, you can very quickly go through worksheet number 2 through each of the 6 components. Each of them has 5 practices, and you could just check off, are you already doing this? Are you doing it partially, or are you doing it fully? And you can also use this, for example, ahead of a strategy refresh. You might say, hey, this is an area we're actually doing quite well in, but here's a logical gap where we're not doing anything. And so it's both a rapid diagnostic, it's a planning tool, and it can also be a really helpful way to engage across teams when you think about, well, how do you move from these ideas into practice? And so we can see here, the statements include things like, our portfolio is actually designed to target leverage points in the systems we work in, or that our criteria already is looking at different time horizons around change, or we have a different or a way that we're explicitly linking individual deals to broader system change. This may seem obvious for some of you, but it's actually quite interesting when you use a tool like this to assess, are you doing it? Do you think you're doing it well? Could you be doing it better? So why don't we, I think people are still responding, so we'll give it another 10 seconds or so. Again, the point of using this tool in particular is that you're able to begin to have a conversation about these issues in a way that is non-intimidating, that provides you with some kind of structure, but also forces you to grapple with what could it look like if we did more of this? If you wanted to regularly evaluate your portfolio level contributions to systemic change, it's really hard to do that later if you haven't considered it upfront. And this is where a lot of investors are struggling right now, right? The question that many investors ask is like, what is the aggregate? What are the ways in which these things fit together? If you haven't really thought through that upfront, it's really hard to have a coherent answer later on. And so partly, I think what this kind of set of resources is trying to do is just help you bring it into your work much more deliberately today. Why don't we just close and share the poll, because I think I'm rapidly running out of time just to share it with folks. Interestingly, we have three respond, or well, I guess a pretty even spread actually. So we assess investments based on their potential for catalyzing systemic change. That's a really good one. And you can do that again through both, maybe more subjective or more objective ways. Others, our portfolio is designed to address multiple leverage points. Our screening criteria consider both immediate and long-term, and our investment strategy explicitly connects deals to systemic transformation. Great. 0%, nobody said we regularly evaluate portfolio level contribution systemic change. And as I said, this is unsurprising, but really hard if you haven't done some of the other stuff. And this is probably flagging one of the areas that collectively all of us need to find ways to be able to spend a bit more time on this in terms of what's next around systems thinking and systemic investing. Why don't I quickly just run through the last three components and the last poll, and then I will wrap up. And so thank you, Tatiana, for this. And I will just quickly go through that. We already did this, so you already have seen this. But you can begin to see, hopefully, that these might be able to tease out a different kind of discussion with your team members than you are having today. It is also helpful to do this with your boards, your ICs, your advisory committees, as you just think about both strategy and investment decisions. And also, it's really helpful to do when you do your annual reviews. And of course, if you're using the impact reporting norms, as we'll talk a little bit about later, you may already begin to embed some of this into that way of thinking. So components 4, 5, and 6. 4 is really focused on ecosystem dynamics and relationships. If you've already worked in this way in philanthropy, for example, this shouldn't be surprising to you. But if you've only worked in investment capacity, this is probably challenging for you because it really forces you to think about what does it look like to have a more relationship orientation with your investees, current, prospective, and even those you decide not to work with or renew. What does it look like to work in a more collective way, either with the existing collective impact initiatives or to initiate new ones? And what does it mean to have more shared accountability for systemic outcomes, which might mean that you change the way you think about how you design impact metrics and also have collective efforts around learning and evaluation. We did some work a few years ago and actually a Impact Frontiers webinar on work around ventures at the helm. In some ways, that was a systemic orientation around shifting the conversation so that ventures are as much in control of what IMM looks like as investors. It's that kind of work that really, I think, forces you to change the way that you interact with others in your ecosystem, including, but not just limited to your investees. Okay, 5 and 6 are really focused on IMM, and I'm hoping that these resonate with most people here. 5 is reframing IMM for adaptability and learning. Almost by definition, a systems thinking approach forces you to move away from the classic static compliance-oriented reporting frame to something more dynamic, more learning-oriented, and then fundamentally actually rethinking the way we think about accountability, additionality, and influence. There's a lot to unpack here, but you can begin to start by just redesigning your impact report. And if you, again, looked at the impact performance reporting norms, you can see that there's an attempt to bring both quant and qual information together to explain your understanding of not only describe your theory of change, but what does it look like in terms of the broader discussions around your role, your influence, and then your reporting. And you can begin to then bring this into how you map your first and second order effects much more tactically. So again, while some of these concepts might feel quite ambitious and it might take time, you can start today and you can build over time. It does force some fundamental kind of rethinking about how you look at IMM. And so component 6 is really just thinking about how we enhance our understanding of IMM to account for more systemic impact. I think this is the most ambitious part because it really forces us to rethink a lot of the components maybe we take for granted in IMM, but perhaps not surprising to the impact frontiers community. We're all using theories of change, IMP dimensions, iris, et cetera, et cetera. What this is doing is forcing us to push beyond that. It's forcing us to widen the scope of how we think about measurement, to integrate new sources of data and perspectives, and then to actually bring new indicators to the table. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can bring more systemic indicators into your frameworks. You can bring new data sources in, right? Stakeholder interviews alongside your classic iris reporting. And think about both lead and lag indicators of systems change and how you might bring them into your work. So there are a number of ways, again, I think you can start, even though the implications of starting on this journey may fundamentally make you shift how you think about IMM, right? What does a multi-layered impact measurement system look like? For example, if you had a multi-decade time horizon, would you rethink the way you think about the relationship between outputs, outcomes, and impacts? What if the whole goal was actually to shift the way we think about how we collect information to be more participatory around its use? So there are a number of implications for this part that I think are both interesting, but also you can start somewhere, in practice today. So why don't we pull up, Tatiana, just the last poll before we wrap up? And there are a number of different practices here to convert shift number 6 into some fairly tactical ways to start that you may already be doing. So pick the statement again that resonates most with you in terms of something you may be doing today or that you think you can do. Are you tracking system level indicators? Are you integrating diverse data sources and approaches? Are you thinking already about approaches that capture changes in dynamics, not just static changes, but really more dynamic changes? Are you using both quant and qual methods? And are you regularly updating your KPIs to think about how the system itself is shifting because of the work of yourself and others? And do you have a mechanism to do that kind of in a disciplined way? So again, I'm hoping you're beginning to see how we can move from the bigger concepts, the combinations that we can deploy, and then this diagnostic or planning tool to bring it into your work in practice. Because the whole point of this, I think, is that it has to be embedded into your work, that there are a number of ways you can do that, and that you don't have to go all the way, right? You can start somewhere, you can progressively build, and then you can actually think about what combinations meet your team, your mission, and your learning environment in order to then kind of build up from there. So maybe we'll kind of close the poll and end, and I'll just say that there's a lot more to talk about. I'm sorry I ran through a lot of this quite quickly, but I'm hoping that, for this crowd that I think is fairly advanced, you can use some of this in your daily practice. So thanks, Mike. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Karim, fabulous. Thank you so much. Such a great overview of a broad range of ways to get started and then to deepen your practice with systems level investing. With that, I would love to first invite all of you who are joining us for this call. If you have questions for Karim, to start popping them in the chat, and we can keep track of them to come back to at the end. While you do that, would love to turn to Tanya. And for this portion, we'll have no slides. It's just going to be a sort of informal Q&A with myself and Tanya to learn more about her practice and what she's learned over the years, putting approaches like we've heard about just now into practice. So Tanya, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here with you all today.
Yeah. And I didn't introduce you very much. Would you be willing to just introduce yourself and Co a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And I just have to apologize that it seems my signal is going off and on, but it'll just have a glitch, if any. So apologies for that. I do live in Mexico. We have not a very solid signal. So sorry for that.
You sound great.
So I'm working in an organization called Co. I'm its CEO and founder. It's Co is a collective of investors that looks to align capital and collaborative action with transformative change. And we use a systems perspective as our main driving tool and goals, the way we work, the way we see the world. Our model, how we work, we have a foundation, we have an investment arm, and we have a mind shift arm of our work. So we have separate entities working together, but essentially our model integrates research, a lot of research into systems, a big part and into collaborative action and collaborative platforms, investing, mindset shift work, and how are we working in shifting our assumptions as investors and as practitioners, and then one team that works in orchestration, so bringing and weaving all the separate parts together to have a shared vision and strategy. And yeah, we are quite big on collective change, I think is the core of our work. We don't believe that as either single or even collective group of family offices, we can drive the work that we want, the change that we want to see in the world. So we're always trying to bring others along, share our practice with others, so that we can multiply the effect of what we're aiming to shift.
Terrific. Thank you, Tania. And one thing that my experience in getting to know Co's work is that when we were getting involved for the first time in systems mapping, we kept on thinking to ourselves, gosh, if we could only find a really concrete example of somebody who's done this in practice. And then we came across Co, and you had been doing this for 10 years. You had been doing this long before it became cool, so to speak. Um, could you talk a little bit about what drew you to a more systemic approach, even before it became such a catchphrase in the industry?
Yes, sure. So I was born and raised in Mexico. I moved around, but mostly in Mexico. Mexico is a country of incredibly high complexity, like many of your countries, I guess, but also incredible inequality, right? It's something that we face every day, and that I faced every day when I was growing up. So I grew up in a pretty privileged family, and I was very moved by just my daily transition of coming out of my bubble of privilege into quite extreme poverty conditions. So that really set me up to, since very young, to, my life's dedicated to shifting that, working first in poverty and then in climate change as a sort of part and parcel to the problem. I studied architecture and master planning, which allows you to see a lot of complexity and how cities work and territories work, and then came back to work with indigenous communities in my country in participatory-led processes, which really influenced my view of the world. We worked in large landscape regeneration projects with them. And so just understanding their incredibly deep vision and principles of interdependence, interrelation, reciprocity was very fundamental to this way of investing, I believe. And then became more fascinated with a more technical aspect of the work in Jay Forrester's work in MIT and Donella Meadows. So it was really about weaving those two worlds. But I think at the heart of it is
Tanya, I think you may have frozen. Is she frozen for others?
Yes.
Oh, we'll give just a second for the internet to come back.
Yeah, I'm shooting her a message.
Oh, there she is.
Thank you, Caro. Apologies for that. I am crossing my fingers. Yeah, there's not
You're back
much I
now.
so anyways, that's sort of that weaving of I guess the heart and the technique. And I found myself weaving those worlds between indigenous knowledge, technical capacities, and also between the worlds of financial wealth and financial scarcity for a very long time. And I just find the ability to map systems gives you that broader perspective. It doesn't allow you to just go to single point solutions and just spend a lot of time in that. So it allows you to step back and hold the space for more complexity over time. So it's a muscle, you know. At first it might be scary, but then you're very used to it. And you know, that's the invitation for people that haven't used a lot of maps. They seem scary in the beginning, but they're incredibly useful once you get used to them. So a bit like your body, you know, it's very, very complex, but once you get into it, you start getting to know your body more and how you can bring it to more health. So I would just say, you know, take it a bit at a time. I've taken now 15 years, Mike, to do this work. So it's taken a long while. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Tania. Well, and okay, so then you mentioned this topic of systems maps. And that was actually the focus of our case study here at Capital. And Peter, maybe if you're able to share the link to the case study. Oh, well, to that as always. In which Tania and the co-team were kind enough to share in more detail about their journey and their use of systems maps in their practice. One thing that we had found in our work is I think it may have come from the Omidyar network, this idea that a systems map is only as useful as the depth of stakeholder engagement and the quality of stakeholder engagement that goes into it. And that's something that I feel like came through really strongly in your case study as well. Would you be willing to share a little bit about how you go about creating a systems map and how do you use it once you've built it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So for us, I would say that the system map is an excuse to get to know people, to get to know different perspective, different viewpoints. And so it's a very heavy lift. And I know a lot of people don't do that lift and might use a lot more desk research for it. But we spend we interview around 100 stakeholders each time we do one of these exercises, really trying to get the picture of you know, multiple perspectives, investors, activists, media, you know, farmers or fishermen. We really spend quite a bit of time doing that work. And we record all those interviews, which are then turned into a map. But for us, the level of understanding that you get in just listening, and listening gives you, yes, the map is there, but gives our team a very broad and sort of deep understanding of perspectives, of potential barriers, of potential challenges, and mostly of incredible opportunities going forward. So we truly believe that just doing this work, yes, takes time, but it just makes you a way better investor because you have, again, that perspective, that nuance of what your investments can face in the future, which you might not get if you don't do this work. So I've seen so many maps now in our path. And even though I can see a map, I feel I still don't have the depth. So I think, you know, to the extent that you can really sit and listen to people, I would strongly argue that this is at the core of our work. We then, of course, use that map to share back to the community and to build community, right? And so for us, the map is sort of, again, the tool or the excuse to build community, to build shared visions. And so we run a lot of workshops to then, you know, I didn't share a lot of this, but then to turn those maps into what are the transition pathways for collective change, right? So what do people believe then that is necessary to shift the future, and how can we do it together? So we use that to fund collaborations that emerge out of those workshops. And we also use that then in our, you know, building our investment strategy. And within each due diligence, we bring back the map, every single investment, how does it relate to the other elements in the pathways that we're trying to fund? How does it relate to other actors as well. Because we map the stakeholders, we also understand, oh, Mike and Karim might be working in this. And so we'll also invest with them, right? So it also allows us to see, because we're very convinced that our capital is way too limited for the type of change that we're trying to see in the world. So it's important to know what Mike and Karim are investing in and how we can do it together, even if we're not co-funding, we're all going in the same direction, So each investment for us is, what is the investment doing in and in itself? What is it doing at a portfolio level? And then what is it doing at a broader ecosystem level? And then, analyzing historical trends and history in the past also helps us to understand, oh, historically there's now a tendency and it's become more fashionable to do this, and there's more capital coming in this stream. So our investment, has more chances to actually push that directionality in broader systems change, right? So we're still working on that, because it is, as Karim mentioned, the sort of edge of the space, and understanding how portfolio level contributions can affect larger systems change. But now with AI and large data sets, we believe we can pull it off in the next year or so. So hopefully we can also share that when we do. But that's where we're working in now. Yeah, I don't know if...
Amazing. Thank you, Tania. So the systems map itself is not the point. It's just an artifact of the deep listening and learning. And it's not static. It's the basis for deepening of those relationships in a reciprocal way.
Absolutely. And we try to update the maps. That's another point in AI going forward, but we try to update the maps every 3 years, because of course you could update them every day, right? It's just one static picture of a dynamic, complex system. We don't have the muscle to do it ongoingly, but so we try to do it every 3 years, which also allows us to bring more voices in to the work that we're doing. So yeah.
Amazing. And then it also actually gets concretely used in the investment process, as you said. It actually comes back into screening, due diligence, deal construction, partnerships, in a very concrete way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very helpful for our investment committee. We invest in a very institutional way in Co. We have outside investment committees. And so at the team level, we're doing all this heavy lift and work. And so the fact that we can share it in our due diligence memos with the IC is very helpful, because we can tell them, this is the complexity that we're looking at. This is how this investment relates to all of these. These are the potential barriers and obstacles that we will face, not the very traditional ones that you would see in an investment memo, but because of the interlinks, you can see sort of, as Karim was saying, this is a leverage point that we're working on. This is how the investment relates to that leverage point. But maybe also, what is the longer distance within the map variable that might actually affect our investment in the long run. So that capacity to analyze our investments, I believe, again, just makes us better at understanding both risks, both potential, and also in a very important way, collaborations and knowledge, right? We bring like this mapping and getting to know people and listening process. What gives us is an incredible capacity to, when we're investing, we're like, oh, remember that expert that came to our process? Can we not call him out, ask him that particular question, right? So it just gives you an amplified capacity to just think through things and act in a more collaborative way.
Fabulous. And then at the same time, recognizing that the systems map is just one tool in the toolkit, so to speak. And Karim really outlined a lot of different techniques and tools that can be used. Were there any others that you would want to sort of elevate and bring people's attention to, that you found especially important or effective?
Wow, we use a lot of tools, Mike, to be honest, all the way from very technical things like the system map to presence in theater in our workshops, and use more like body and presence to map systems. I have to say that over time, we found presence in theater to be incredibly effective in mapping systems, almost at par to system maps. Like what you can see in the collective body is just stunning. Because we use then not our like more intellectual aspect of our work, but more our body and all the knowledge that we have collectively in our bodies. So that's one that I just find so magical every time we do it. I'm like, that's incredible. How did, like, could have we just skipped the map because it's such a heavy lift? Now we have it here in full presence. And what is very powerful about that tool in particular that I will highlight is that that knowledge gets impregnated in the bodies of all participants. And so we've done like present like system mapping with body with more than 50 participants. And once your body understands it, then your head does as well, right? So it's quite miraculous what happens once we do those. We always start with that in our workshops, in our collective workshops. Then everybody is sort of bodily aligned in what we're supposed to be shifting. You know, we could spend days talking about the complexity of it, but it just comes down in the body in a very powerful way that then we can turn around again into investment strategies and processes. And we work a lot in transition pathway tools and desirable futures. We try to collectively imagine what is the future that we're trying to build together. This is super important, right? In our interviews process, we always ask, what is that beautiful world that you can imagine? What does it look like? We need to be able to touch it, to really imagine it together so that it actually happens. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So that's also like collective imagination and a desired collective future together that we can all uphold together is an incredibly powerful tool, I believe. So then each one can say, okay, I'll do this bit and you do that bit, but at least we're all going in the same direction. That's why for us, the collective and the collaborative is such an essential part of our work.
Tanya, I saw people's heads nodding, and especially my friend Elisa, who I think herself has a background in theater. I bet people would be really interested to learn more about some of the tools that you mentioned just now around presencing and embodying and theater-based tools, if you're able to share either now or maybe if you want to send them to me later, any references, we can send them out in the follow-up email afterwards. Excuse me.
Happy to. And I think somebody already posted at Awana there.
Oh, amazing.
Has been
Fabulous.
for a long time, so definitely worth checking out. Yeah.
Great. And last question. I understand you're doing some work or planning to do some work on measurement of systems change, if I've got that right, with Deep Transitions Lab. Were you able to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course, of course. It's very exciting work. I think it talks to the point of Karim's polls talking about how can you measure, how can you know if you're actually being effective in this whole thing of systems change. Now it's very trendy, and to be honest, we never talked about it because it sounds very arrogant and ambitious. And as investors, we're very much feet in the ground. We love doing community like working in the ground, right? So thinking about systems, even though it's what we did, we almost never mention it because it's just we're careful with what it means and then the expectations that it brings, right? But we now are embarked in this mission with DT Labs because we think what the key contribution to our work that DT Labs brings is a capacity to see back in history and analyze historical trends and then shift that into the future. Okay, if this is what's happening without us, these are the trends, these are the transitions that have been happening, then how can we contribute to then flipping it over into the future and then selecting, if we have $10, shall we put those $10 into a trend that's already emerging and getting stronger and stronger, and then our $10 will amplify that? Or do we want our $10 to open up a totally new niche that nobody's financing? And so then, this is the conversations that we can have in our Co is a steward-led organization. Governance plays a key role in what we're trying to shift. So for those that don't know steward-led organizations, we're separating capital from power, right? It doesn't matter if our family offices have a tremendous amount of capital or very little. Voting is separate from that. And so that's something that we're also very passionate about. But at the steward level, these are the discussions, what is Co to do? Is Co's work to be opening new niches and new innovations, or maybe part of our portfolio should be, designated to that? And then maybe part of our portfolio should, amplify what's already happening. We always talk about like rivers and currents of rivers, that current is already stronger. Let's go, let's put capital there. Strategically, of course, to where it's missing to become mainstream, because it might already just need a little bit of a push. Whereas, we might go totally frontier, and, we also know that with that capital, we're going to have to wait 20 to 30 years and bring others along with us if we ever are going to see a change. So I'm saying, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And how are we working on this with DT Labs? Is that we're really betting on large data sets and AI tools to help us analyze, large data, because in the end, we interview 100 people every time we do one of our investment strategies, or maybe, even 200 in some cases, but that still is, a drop in the bucket. So if we can, do that deep listening in our interviews, but then amplify it with larger data sets, we believe, again, we're going to become just better at what we do, or so we hope, and that's the only thing that we can do, hope for larger change and just larger collaborations. So, very much looking forward to hopefully getting to know many of the people that joined today, and why are you doing what you're doing, and are there paths to be crossed? Because this is the only bet that we have. I mean, we all know the complexity that we're in, and that it will just continue to grow. So for me, it's about building that muscle of collaboration together. We could have just stayed at the single family office level, and it would have been a very comfy and comfortable zone to stay in, but we just don't think it's going to make it. So, getting out of our comfort zone, talking to other people, what are you doing? How can we do this together? Is the only thing that we believe will actually shift systems in the long run.
What a fabulous note to close on. Thank you, Tania. This has been so helpful both to hear from Tania and from Karim, two superstars in one tightly packed hour. We've come right up against time. We probably do have time for one or two questions if anybody would like to share any. I would say just come off mute and ask your question if you'd like to. Please feel also to share a question in the chat.
I have a question. I really appreciated this conversation. Just curious, there are a number of tools that were mentioned, and I wonder, for a group that's starting out with sort of orienting teams to systems thinking, is it the playbook that's the best sort of go-to, or is there another sort of like go-to source to help teams take on this work and sort of understand what the intentions are?
Mike, I would be happy to share all the tools that we use. And I don't know what the space is. I think Karim has many as well. We're part of the Twist community. I'm a board member to Transcap. They're doing that all the time. So, but, happy to do that, Amelia. Throw it in.
Thank you.
And we'll speak until close. And Karim, also, you want to jump in a little bit?
Yeah, I would say start with the primer, the one that I shared, that just provides a pretty helpful entry point and some framing up front. And then tools 1 and 2 on the playbook that we just demoed, those are easy to get started. And as Tania was saying, yeah, there's other groups they've been doing this. I'll share a link where I listed some of those from Transcap, Tip, Twist, and others that might also be helpful. And we can also probably send that out, Mike, to others.
Fabulous. Thank you both. And I see that we actually are over time, but we also have a ton of people who are still staying on. So as long as we have a good quorum here, please feel free to roll off if you need to. But we have a kind of a profound question from Suzanne Jenkins of Impact Shakers. How do you balance the top-down view and the spaces for bottom-up emergence? That's a big one.
I'm happy to answer that one. Karim,
Please.
do you want to go?
No, you go ahead. I think this is exactly down your
Yes, it is. That's why I'm like jumping out of the chair, as they say. But that is a nut to crack, Suzanne, right? And it's a beautiful nut to crack in my perspective. We spend such a long time, and happy to jump on a call whenever, because that is a longer conversation. We do both at this in parallel, right? And then weave them together, right? So the top-down view work that we do, the interviews, the system map, that's a parallel track. Then, as I mentioned, we do a lot of workshops that we bring together community members, investors, the multiple groups. And then, we work a lot in that emergence. That's why we use presence in theater. That is an emergence practice. And then we spend maybe 2 or 3 days just talking about what that could look like and what is their role, each of their roles to play within their own communities, right? So there's a whole methodology that we've developed over time. I grew up doing participatory planning, and so again, the desirable future of that collective group, and then how can it amplify, and then how does it weave back into the top-down view. It gets a little bit complex, but we then shift that into an investment portfolio, and we use blended finance, right? We can invest, in our case, we can do philanthropy, and we can do catalytic capital, and we can do more traditional capital. So, I guess we have the privilege to work across the capital spectrum in that way. But it's fun, I would say. It's a lot of fun to even try this out. Yeah. Not sure, Kurt,
Thank you,
if you
Tania.
want to add.
Kurt, do you want to jump in also?
No, I'm good for now. Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, with that, I think that we can begin to wrap things up. Karim and Tania, thank you so much for being willing to share your work and your insights and your passion with all of us. It sounds like there's a lot of interest from this group, and we'd be happy to collect whatever further resources you'd like to share and send them in the follow-up email. In the meantime, please do check out the RPA resources that Karim sent, and then the case study from Co, as well as lots of other great work that Co has done. Thank you for joining, and have a great rest of your weeks. Bye now.